Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar discussion, Policy Recommendations to Improve U.S. Military and Overseas Voting. My name is Kamanzi Khalisa, and I'm Director of CSG's new Overseas Voting Initiative. Last year, CSG entered into a partnership with the U.S. Department of Defense's Federal Voting Assistance Program to improve the U.S. military and overseas voting process. The initiative convenes and supports parallel working advisory groups, policy and technology that promote best practices, as well as facilitate data standardization policy solutions affecting over 5 million U.S. military and civilian overseas registered voters. U.S. military and civilian overseas voters are often located in remote areas abroad, lacking access to the voting information and technology used by stateside voters in their home voting precincts, making it quite challenging for Americans overseas to cast their ballots. Variations in how states conduct elections, and in particular how absentee ballots are provided, returned, and counted, can make voting even more complex. In today's CSG eCademy webinar, the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Initiative Policy Working Group will explore policy recommendations that can help states improve the U.S. military and civilian overseas voting process. Saying that, I'm pleased to be joined today by Jim Condos, who has served as the Vermont Secretary of State for the past 5 years and is currently an important member of CSG's Overseas Voting Initiative's Policy Working Group. In his previous life, Secretary Condos served as Vermont State Senator for 8 years while actively serving as a legislative member of the Council of State Governments. Today, Secretary Condos will discuss online voter registration and its effect on the U.S. military and overseas voting process. We're also joined by David Stafford, who serves as the Supervisor of Elections for Escambia County, Florida, as well as the co-chair of CSG's Overseas Voting Initiative's Policy Working Group. Escambia County consistently ranks as a top national performer when it comes to U.S. military and overseas voting. Today, Mr. Stafford will discuss how improved communication to voters can affect the U.S. military and overseas voting process. Michael Vu currently serves as the Registrar of Voters for San Diego County, California, the third largest election jurisdiction in California and the 8th largest election jurisdiction in the nation, with a registered voting population of well over 1.5 million in San Diego County. Mr. Vu is an important member of CSG's Overseas Voting Initiative's Policy Working Group and will speak today about the impact of military community engagement in the U.S. military and civilian overseas voting process. And last but not least, Tammy Patrick, Senior Advisor of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In 2013, Ms. Patrick was selected by President Barack Obama to serve on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, a bipartisan commission comprised of distinguished election administrators and private sector companies for the purpose of identifying best practices in election administration. Ms. Patrick previously served as Federal Compliance Officer in the Maricopa County, Arizona Elections Department for 11 years. Tammy Patrick will discuss the role that the federal postcard application plays in the U.S. military and civilian overseas voting process from her perspective as a former Arizona election administrator. Well, thank you all for joining today's discussion. Secretary Condos, we are ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Kamanzi. This is Jim Condos, and I'm going to speak about online voter registration and actually something new that we're adding in a few weeks called My Voter Page. But as far as the online voter registration goes, we are going live with that in mid-October. We did not require any special legislation to do it. We had enough flexibility in our voter registration statutes to allow us to move forward with it. We expect to have a very positive impact on UOCAVA voters as we go down the road with this. And as I said, it will be going live starting mid-October. So first, let's talk about online voter registration and what it does for us. Essentially, there's two key points that I think that are important. One, it increases access, and two, it improves accuracy. But let's get into a little more detail on those. As far as the increased access piece, the primary benefit is increased access to registration for the general public, including overseas and military voters. Increased access will benefit overseas and military the most because their only other option is a slow process by mail, whereas most people can walk into their clerk's office. To increase participation for military and overseas voters, the first step is to simplify and speed up our registration process, which the online voter reg system will do. As far as the increased or improved accuracy, the further benefit of online voter registration is a reduction in excuse me, there is a reduction in errors in the data entry. Clerks will no longer have to read handwriting on forms and enter it into the checklist. Data is transferred into the checklist exactly as it's entered by the voter. After review by the clerk, all applications are still reviewed and approved by those clerks. The related benefit here obviously is budgetary, as represented by time saved by the town clerks in processing registrations. Processing online voter registrations will be faster than processing paper with no data entry. Towns should see a benefit in that less of their town clerks will be using their valuable time to perform data entry for registrations and allow them to do their other work as well. And we're really excited about this going forward. As I said, we believe this is going to increase the accuracy of the information and will also move us closer to a common data format for every voter in our state. The data from all online registrations will look the same. No more ST or versus street spelled out, for example. All addresses, phone numbers, and other data will come into the checklist in the same exact format. Slight budgetary advantage for our office as well, as we will reduce spending on printed registration forms and the time spent by our clerks or by our staff having to sort online voter registrations that we receive and then forward them on to the appropriate clerk. This is not a large cost for us in the first place, but it will certainly reduce our own cost. We will still need to print some of the paper forms for use in specific contexts, but we will print fewer than we have in the past, and we will see fewer that go to waste. Now, the other thing that we're really excited about is something that we're instituting in our new elections management system, which the whole package is going live next month, and that's called My Voter Page, or MVP for short. It's being rolled out at the same time, and it will be available to all currently registered voters, whether they registered online or not. Essentially what it's going to do is it's going to provide improved voter information. So this will be a significant benefit to all registered voters, including UACAVA voters, providing them with a web page unique to them with a secure login with voter-specific information that includes where their polling place is, what the election dates are, a sample ballot that will be available for them, and clerk contact information as well as candidate listings. It will also provide for a very simple absentee ballot tracking, and this will happen mostly, this is the most important feature, is the ability to actually request and track the status of an absentee ballot through their own My Voter page. Benefit to all voters, but especially to overseas and military voters, will significantly increase the speed with which requests are processed and the ballots are made available. UACAVA voters ballots will be accessible through the individual's My Voter page through the secure login, as I stated, for them to download, print, vote, and return by mail to the clerk. Previously, an overseas voter had no way to track the ballot once it was mailed back to the clerk, other than repeatedly contacting the clerk to find out if they had received it. The login to the My Voter page is simple. It will require first name, last name, date of birth, and either a driver's license number or state-issued PID number from the DMV or their last 4 digits of their Social Security number. So that really explains what we're doing. We think we've simplified the processes overall. For overseas and military voters, we're actually providing a much more streamlined basis of possibilities for them, but we're also providing them with a lot more information through their My Voter page, and the fact that they will be able to track their absentee ballot regardless of where they are. So, Kamanzi, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Condos. Now, David Stafford, who's the Supervisor of Elections for Escambia County, Florida. David?
Good afternoon, everyone. Kamanzi. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to go over a few things. Our subgroup was charged with looking at the issue of voter communications. And we came up with 6 items that I'm going to run through relatively quickly, and then share a little bit of experience that we've had here in our county, which again is heavily military. Those of you who are familiar with the area, we're considered the cradle of naval aviation. Basically, any Navy aviation person comes through flight school at some point in time through Pensacola. We're also home to the Blue Angels. But we also have a lot of other tenant commands, including the Center for Information Dominance, which is where it used to be the Cryptology Center, where all of the folks that are going to be protecting us from the next military cyber attack, that's where they're all being trained here in locally as well. Which all that goes to say is that we have many UOCAVA voters here, so we have it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and serving. So the fourth sort of item is plain language, and this comes up not only in dealing with UOCAVA voters, military and overseas voters, but also with domestic voters as well. We oftentimes have to talk among our staff and among my colleagues in our other counties that the language that we use on a day-to-day basis is a lot of times foreign to your average everyday voter who's thinking about voting at best, 2 times every couple of years. One of the challenges that we have is, and again speaking locally here in Florida, is that a lot of the verbiage that we have to use in communicating with our voters is statutorily prescribed down to literally you must use the following instructions. You must use the following words in your the oath that you have that the voter has to take. So what that does is it limits our ability a lot of times to use plain language. But a couple of things. One is as we move through the process and try to streamline that, we do have an opportunity to clean that up to make sure we're using language that voters understand and not simply that what election officials understand, and try to communicate with these folks, understanding particularly with military and overseas voters that this is something that they may have very little time to be able to concentrate on. So we want to make sure that it's as streamlined as possible and that we're communicating as clearly as possible with them. And one of those things is talked about using checklists to be included with your absentee ballots. So these are the 3 or 4 things that I need to do to make sure that I get my ballot counted in this election. And the last sort of thing I'll say on that is that to the extent that as policymakers, state officials can move away from using that kind of statutory language, prescribing exact language, and maybe leave that to the rulemaking process. It gives, I think, a little bit more flexibility where if we see something that can be improved, we don't necessarily have to go each time back through the legislative process, which can sometimes be a little bit more difficult than perhaps going through a rulemaking process. The next one is election websites, and it's one of the things that we did a couple of years ago here in Escambia County. And we don't have a separate website. What we do is we have an area on our website that you can get to from the home page that is slated just for military and overseas voters. So what it tries to do is encapsulate what we've attempted to do is encapsulate all the information, the basic information that you would need if you were indeed a military and overseas voter, to help walk you through the registration process, the absentee request process, as well as information on how to track your ballot, and anything about that's specific to Florida as it relates to anything Florida specific. One of the things here I think it's important is that it's my personal belief that the closer that you get to the local election official with the voter, the better, because they're the ones ultimately that are going to be canvassing that voter's ballot. So in other words, rather than if you can get your voters to go directly to your local election official, that to me is the best case scenario versus funneling it through FVAP, then down to the chief election official of the state, then down to the local election official. The closer you can get to the person that's actually going to be canvassing that ballot, the better it is, because they can communicate best to the voter what needs to happen to make sure that voter gets their ballot and then is able to have it returned and tabulated. Returning the ballots is perhaps the biggest challenge that remains in my opinion, with military and overseas voters. We've come tremendous distance in improving the delivery of ballots to military and overseas voters. At least I'm speaking from experience here in the state of Florida. But where we still have a challenge is getting those ballots back. Here in the state of Florida, electronic return other than a fax is not allowed, and I know as many secretaries of state who have and other election officials who have gone on trips overseas have heard directly from voters that it's that fax technology is ancient, and if you can find a fax machine, you'd be lucky. And so one of the things also is those what we like to call those origami envelopes, and so there should be some increased effort on improving the way that the traditional, whether or not you want to include that traditional envelope or some more user-friendly electronically delivered design of that origami. And then of course you get into the relatively sensitive policy discussions that that tend to come up and that have waxed and waned over the years about the electronic return of ballots, knowing the sensitivity that there is with security. Some states are a little bit more allowing in that respect than other states. Again, Florida does not allow that. But at the end of the day, that is, I believe, the area where the most benefit could be had moving forward, and that is if we figure out a good way to increase the ability for voters to return their ballots in a safe and secure manner. Next would be the notice of the FVAP rejection or acceptance, and that is basically that we as election officials should notify the voter if the application is accepted, and also that the ballot would be sent within the 45-day parameter, and that also, importantly, that the notification provide the length and validity for the request, because as you all perhaps know, there is a national standard for how long a UOCAVA request, but for instance, in the state of Florida, ours can be extended to 2 full general elections cycles. And as we know, that there could be 2 or 3 people sitting next to each other during the elections process from different jurisdictions, different states, and that may have different rules. So it's important for, again, your local election official to communicate directly with their voters, and that can also be done through an electronic means of delivering that information to the voter. At one point on this electronic communication, one of the challenges that we've seen here in the state of Florida is there's kind of a delicate balance, because in order to be able to communicate with voters electronically, we have to have information from those voters about how to do that, specifically for email addresses. And one of the things where we've had this friction is between the advocates that for open records, we have perhaps one of the most open, least restrictive public records laws in the country here in Florida. And what happens is you get the voter that does not like their personal information being shared, and once that is shared, then it becomes a public record, and then it's available to anybody who wants that information. There are some exceptions as it relates to specific information that's garnered to communicate with absentee voters, and also now we actually just had an exception written into the law in the last session that again was over the objections of some of these advocates for open records, that there be an exemption for people that are in the doing specific duties within the armed forces. Anyway, so I just sort of throw that out there as something that's going to, I think, continue to be an issue moving forward, and that is, in order for us to be able to communicate effectively, we have to have that information that, once again, then would become public, and so sometimes people are reluctant to give that. Last two real quickly: free access system, and that is so people can know when their ballot, where their ballot is, and within the process, as well as the notice of accepting, both acceptance and rejection of an absentee ballot within the same free access system. Ours already does that. You can get that information simply from entering your specific information into our website. The thing that we find is a lot of voters, once they vote, actually don't take advantage of that. It's sort of out of mind, out of sight. So I think there's an expectation that voters would utilize such a system, and perhaps if it's marketed better, they would. Well, we don't see a whole heck of a lot of people that actually dial in to find out if indeed their ballot was accepted. And finally, sample ballots, and that is basically making sure that information is available, that voter information is available to voters, particularly that are not outside of your jurisdiction. That there's an easy way to get to that information. Now, one of the challenges, again, in sample ballots, as we discussed when formulating these recommendations, is that for us, at least here in Florida, the way that our election calendar works, a lot of times you would be running up against the same deadline for getting your absentee ballots out to your voters at that 45-day deadline around the same time that you would be getting the sample ballot out. And so there's a question is, if you're going to have some voter confusion if you send a voter a sample ballot and then a day later they get their actual ballot. So, but I think there is some happy medium there where we can talk about the information that will be on your ballot, and that kind of information can be shared months out versus when you get down to who the actual candidates are. In other words, know that in this coming up election you're going to have the president, have your senator and congressional race and county commission, et cetera, without knowing perhaps who exactly those candidates are going to be. So with that, I know that was kind of a lot, but I will turn it back over to you, Kamanzi, and be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Mr. Stafford. Now we'll be joined by Michael Vu, who currently serves as the Registrar of Voters for San Diego County, California. Mr. Vu, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can coming? Kamanzi?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Kamanzi stated, my name is Michael Vu. I'm the Registrar of Voters for the County of San Diego. So let me just, if I can, start with maybe a background of San Diego County. I really wanted to touch base on the policy side of what the CSG policy overseas voting group was in my particular area. But I wanted to really start with an overall background of San Diego County. So when you think of San Diego County, many want to think about the sun and the beaches of our county, not knowing that really the county has over 3 million in population and has a registered population, as what Kamanzi said, of nearly 1.5 million registered voters, and of course that fluctuates depending on list maintenance there. But it's also over 4,500 square miles in size, and so when you think of San Diego, think not just of sunny San Diego, but also that it's a relatively large jurisdiction overall. Now, a big portion of that landmass that I was talking about, that 4,500 square miles, is really dedicated to military and military activities. So when it comes to the military, we have 7 military bases, including the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, the Marine Corps Recruit Depot of San Diego, one of 2 in the country, Naval Base Coronado, Naval Base Point Loma, Naval Base San Diego, and then also the U.S. National Coast Guard Station of San Diego. And so when the CSG's Overseas Voting Initiative was compiled and we were selected and asked to join this group and break down what perhaps our policy recommendations that would become, I was really interested in this notion and really, frankly, intrigued on this notion of improving the engagements with the U.S. military community. And one of the reasons why I was interested and intrigued in this area and volunteered myself to this specific area is because of not only the breadth and size and military and size of populations that we have in San Diego County, but is because we are also very proud of other programs that we have in place within San Diego County, and something, if you will, as opposed to the general population, registered voter population, there's also the subpopulations. For us, one of those subpopulations is our language, federally covered Section 203 languages that we track, and we have 4 languages other than English, of course, that we serve here in the County of San Diego. Those include Spanish, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Chinese. But and so we've done a lot of work in the area of our language, federally covered language groups, and the tracking metrics and our engagement out there into the community. And so this really intrigued me in terms of our military and overseas engagement for not only those that are deployed, but also our veterans within the County of San Diego. So San Diego County is one of those unique counties where it's one of the largest concentration of active and veteran populations living in the United States, but also we are unique in the sense that we are just bordering, Mexico, which has a lot of overseas citizens living there of ours. And so, again, it was one of those areas where it took me back and said, well, what are we doing in terms of our engagement? Beyond those federal laws that were passed, whether it was UOCAVA or whether or not it was the MOVE Act. And so we took really a step back from that notion and did specific things, and that's one of the things that I wanted to speak with you today in terms of what San Diego County is doing in terms of improving our engagements with the military and overseas community, as well as our veteran and expatriate populations as well. Just to give you some level of context, when it comes down to our deployed military and overseas, it ranges from anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 deployed members at any given times that are living within San Diego County. Although the populations of the military exceeds over 150,000 military as well as family members living in the county. And so one of the things that we've tried to do here is to look at it not just from the perspective of voting in general, but the county has gone through this initiative. It's a 10-year initiative that is specifically geared towards having San Diego County thrive in terms of every aspect of its quality of life. It's called Live Well San Diego. It's a 10-year initiative, and part of that initiative relates to our military and overseas and our veteran populations. Similar to, as I said before, how is our covered languages are doing? Well, part of that is how well is our military and overseas families and those that are actively deployed doing in terms of not just voting, but also our health and human services, anything from health and human services to pets and animal services to library services and the services that they can provide there. So, of course, our discipline is specific to elections, and we looked at that and said to ourselves, well, what are all of the things that we're doing today, and what can we be doing better, and what should we be doing? And so let me describe some of those things that we are doing. So I think one of the main things that we have looked at and we have been doing is job fairs. One of the things that we've seen is that there's a mutual benefit when my staff, it has a staff of 65 individuals, but we balloon to 600 to 800 individuals that we hire on a seasonal basis. And so we've been actively going to job fairs, specifically to those that are military and overseas, for two specific reasons. One is to not only hire individuals that are in the military and in the military, but also to target the spouses. In that way, not only are we raising the awareness of the opportunities of voting that would come with hiring those spouses or those people that are part of a military family, but also to benefit them in that they're here and to employ them within the county. The other area is also universities. What we are finding is that there are huge military and overseas and veterans programs within our universities, and so we are working with them to target those to participate in whatever activities that they are doing. The other thing that we've done also is learn from my colleagues in other states and in other jurisdictions. One of the opportunities that those that sit on the CSG group had an opportunity is go to Pensacola, which and speak with Dave Stafford, and we got an opportunity to tour his facilities, but also got to see the interaction that he has with his commanding officer and the military installation that we had there, and learn about how unique that is to have not only Dave but the commanding officer talk with each other on a first-name basis and also meet monthly as to what is happening in the elections world. And then finally, we are attending every single USCIS ceremonies that is occurring within the county of San Diego, and you'd find not only are these individuals becoming citizens, but you'd be surprised of how many of those individuals that are becoming new citizens are active military folks. And so we have reached out to those and have continued to do that within San Diego County. When I look at the tracking side of our engagements, and that's where we start here in terms of our program, I draw a number of different parallels. And if we looked at the last presidential general election, we had about a 65% return rate of those military and overseas voters that we issued a ballot to. Well, the overall percentage of the election for the last 2012 presidential general election was at 78%. And so I compare that, but then I also compare it with these other subgroups that we're also talking about. And for me, again, it goes back to that language group. And what we're saying in this, at least this presidential general election, is we saw a 68% return rate for our language group. So you compare the active military, which we had a return rate of about 65% return rate, and then you look at our language groups, and that's about a 68%. You're saying to yourself that that's not much, that's pretty close. But if you looked at the off-cycle elections, you really see a big disparity in terms of the overall return rate within the military and overseas. Those are things that we're trying to find out why that's occurring and how we can improve those. And so one of the things is, of course, engaging our commanding officers and the voting assistance officers within our county. I think one of the differences that I would say that one of the great things that I saw with that Stafford had was this close relationship. Translating that to San Diego County may be a little bit different because of the total number of military installations that we have in San Diego County, and so we're looking at different ways of being able to engage our militaries. And as I said before, job fairs, we're actively hiring those that are military or those that are veterans, those are our spouses. The universities is another way of engaging our military and overseas, whether it's indirectly or directly. Finally, let me just say that we don't want, knowing that there are a lot of individuals in military and overseas voters that are really here to either get trained or are stationed here for only a short time frame, knowing that San Diego County is not their home of record, we want to be a one-stop shop for them, meaning we want to also provide this personal touch. That is, we know that they are trying to either register or to vote, and they may not be registering or trying to vote in San Diego County, but their home of record is somewhere else. And so we want to be able to provide that personal touch in terms of assisting them to get to their correct jurisdiction, whether it's a supervisor of elections, as in Florida, or a county clerk in another state, or a board of elections in another jurisdiction. We want to be that a resource to them to be able to actively and accurately get through the process. With that said, I'm going to turn the time back over to Kamanzi.
Thank you, Mr. Vu. And last but not least, Tammy Patrick, Senior Advisor of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and formerly the Federal Compliance Officer in the Maricopa County, Arizona Elections Department for 11 years. Tammy?
Thank you, Kamanzi. So to start off today, I really wanted to talk about the federal postcard application. And I also need to first have a confession that I am PowerPoint dependent. And so there is a PowerPoint that'll go along with this. And I am very appreciative that Carrie will be advancing the slides for me. And we can go ahead and get started with that now, if you don't mind, Carrie. And you can go ahead and advance to the main of the first slide. Thank you. So Maricopa County, Arizona is basically the greater Phoenix metropolitan area with 4 million population roughly, and then 2 million registered voters. Election officials kind of have a secret handshake where you quickly run down your population, your registered voters, if you have any covered languages, how your voters are voting. So for instance, in Maricopa County, about 65% of our voters were on a permanent list. And that gives you a pretty good snapshot of the jurisdiction I'm talking about. What I wanted to speak today was to share with you two presentations or portions therein that I used during my time in Maricopa County to talk about the federal postcard application. First is the Arizona Secretary of State certification program for election officials, coverage of the FPCA, and then also a community network, which was a network of advisors. We had monthly meetings with stakeholders regarding election-related issues. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the federal compliance laws that we talked about in the Arizona Secretary of State certification program, and you can go ahead and advance it one more time because I think there's happens to be some animation that I forgot about. So in Arizona, the Secretary of State has a certification program that requires all election officials to become certified and then be recertified every 2 years. And the bulk of the curriculum was taught by actual election officials and then members of the Secretary of State staff. So we can advance to the next slide and then quickly go to the one after that because it's a title slide covering UACAVA. So UACAVA has some very special challenges in servicing this population. First is that we're talking about a very highly mobile voting population with unconventional locations. And Carrie, on this, I apologize, I didn't realize that there was animation. You can go ahead and just click through so it'll populate the next two talking points as well. So there are unconventional locations, there's frequent changes in location for this voting population, and that also provides potential lack of access to resources that voters who are present locally, we heard it mentioned in one of the earlier speakers, they have access to this information because they see the signs on the street corner that there's an election coming up. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we would do in class would cover the law itself and actually look to the statutory language and in the law itself, and waiting for that slide to come up here for you all, it talks about the official postcard form prescribed under section 173FF of this title, which requires simultaneous voter registration application and absentee ballot application. So in Arizona, and the states kind of look to this in a variety of ways. In Arizona, our individual state statute also provided that the voters would participate not only in federal elections, but also state and local elections. So all elections they would be eligible in if they registered with the federal postcard application. Next slide, please. So the reason that we would talk about this in the Secretary of State's class, and we would actually show the federal postcard application, which you'll see here in just a moment, is that it's very important, I think, to understand that some states, and Arizona was one of them, took this law literally, that when it says that the federal postcard application would be used to register and could also be used to request a ballot the same document, that these voters were in fact registered voters. We put them on the active registration roll in the same way that we would if they were using a state form or the federal voter registration form. And then what we viewed, and what many states, but not all do, is that the duration of time that the FPCA was valid, which it varied by state until the MOVE Act, and some states still allow for a greater time period than just one election cycle, is that it would be only the application for the ballot that had any sort of a time constraint upon it, that the voter was an active, registered voter along with all other voters, and the only way to cancel that registration for states that were under the National Voter Registration Act would be to go through the same process of removal of a voter from the rolls as any other voter. Now, this is really important because of the definitions that are used from one state to the next, because in some states, and I know there are some legislators on the line, there are individuals from various Secretary of State's offices, it's important to take a look at how the states are treating military and overseas voters who register using the federal postcard application, because in some instances, these voters are not on the active rolls. They're in a temporary or suspended status. They don't get a voting history. The calculation of turnout is actually inflated at the expense of these voters, and there's a real impact on these voters when they return to the United States. Now, I think that there's some technical difficulties with the presentation itself, so I'm just going to continue to forge ahead. And then, Carrie, when you are able to regain control of the slides, we'll quickly get caught up with me. So when it comes back, I'm now on number 8, which is a lovely picture of an aircraft carrier. So the reason, there we go. Boy, I felt omnipotent for a moment there. But I think it's important to really address the fact that these voters face the obstacles of time and distance. And eliminating one step, whether it's the registration and then a ballot application, increases the likelihood that these voters are going to be able to successfully participate in many cases in the democracy that they are in fact defending. And then the next slide, please. So the FPCA itself, we walked through in class some of the portions of the form and what it asks the voter, because first and foremost, there's the establishment of the eligibility of the coverage, as well as categorizing the type of voter that they are, whether they're military or overseas, whether they're there indefinitely, and that sort of thing. So that's one of the first things that happens, and that's part of the data collection that occurs with the FPCA. Next slide, please, when you get there. And so it also has the ability for the voter to put in how they would like to have their ballot sent to them. So this was the offset of the MOVE Act. So voters can request to have it be delivered to them via online or an email mechanism through the standard mail, and then also by fax. And voters who receive this coverage by completion of the FPCA and UOCAVA, their ballots have to be sent out 45 days prior to election day. So they're afforded a longer time period. And then we're on slide 11, should it catch up. Really, I think it's important to recognize that internet transmission, at least one way, can really aid voters in many instances, but there's no panacea, I think, for any voting population in any regard, whether it's the military and overseas voters, because you'll have some that won't have access to the internet. You'll have some that have very questionable postal services. But it's certainly, we need to be doing everything that we can, utilizing and leveraging the technology to reach out to as many voters as we possibly can. And then the next slide goes through the FPCA affirmation. And this is really important because the completion of the federal postcard application, the voter goes through and they swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that they are a U.S. citizen, that the information is true and accurate. It goes through a couple of other sworn affirmations that really covers that they are in fact eligible to receive some of these special considerations, such as the electronic receipt of their ballot and the additional days to complete their ballot. The next slide, which is the last slide in our Secretary of State's procedure training, talks about the fact that in Arizona we were the first to have and offer online voter registration starting back in 2002. It's something I've advocated for over a decade now, and it's exciting that so many states are now offering those services. But one of the things to consider as states are rolling out online voter registration is the integration of the federal postcard application, data collection, categories and the affirmation to make sure that we can capture these voters all at one time. The next slide, and we're now on slide number 14, was a representation of a community network meeting that we held where we went through some best practices. In Arizona, we did not integrate the SPCA back in 2002, and instead what we did at the local level, and now we're on slide 15 and we're almost done, has to do with, as I believe it was, Mr. Stafford was mentioning, on the website itself offering information to this subcategory of voters, our military and overseas voters, all in one precise location is certainly recommended. And so what we did is we offered the federal postcard application as an online fillable document that integrates with the voter registration or EMS system itself, along with, and then the second to last slide, some very concise and precise and plain language information to those voters about how easy it is for them to, one, register, two, request their ballot, and to be covered under UOCAVA, and then to receive and return their ballot. And then next, the last piece just talks again about the various ways that they can receive and return the ballot. And so just in summation, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that many of the things we mentioned today and many of the things that the policy working group has been discussing in the last year or so really does tie into the Presidential Commission on Election Administration and the things that we heard in our hearings all around the country. So for those of you on the line that are in a role where you have some leadership that you can take in terms of statutory requirements or rulemaking authority or procedures and process, consider looking at how the federal postcard application and the federal write-in absentee ballot are used in your state. Think about online voter registration, providing online voter information, including ballot tracking, the establishment of advisory boards engaging stakeholders, use of plain language, providing sample ballots, data collection and analysis. All of these things were certainly part of the PCA recommendations, and I'm just very thrilled to be part of the CSG and the FAP working group on the policies, and looking forward to getting some of these things implemented in a more widely distributed way. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kamanzi. Thank you very much. And the presentation will be available, I believe, anyone that needs to see the pretty pictures.
And thank you, Tammy, and I apologize to everyone, to Tammy as well, for any technical difficulties with our PowerPoint presentation, but it will be accessible online on various CSG platforms and YouTube. So I have a few questions for you all. First question, and feel free, anyone can, whoever the first to volunteer can answer the question, or if anyone wants to chime in as well. The first question I have is, the 2016 elections are pretty much here. Candidates for political office are currently campaigning and raising campaign money. Voters are beginning to tune in and follow the various campaigns as well. Can these policy recommendations be put to use by state and local policymakers and election administrators in time to make a real difference in this election? What would that process look like?
Kamanzi, this is Jim Condos, and I guess I would just throw out that what I had talked about it with our online voter registration and our my voter page, the individual voters' own page, web page, those will all be active and live next month for us. So we're excited going into that. We have a little bit of lead time on this, but we're really excited about this, and it will be ready for starting with our presidential primary, which is in March.
Kamanzi, this is Dave Stafford. I think that certainly some of these things are easier to implement and can be done unilaterally, if you will, by if you're an LEO, local election official, a state election official, versus something that would require a policy change, whether through rulemaking or a statutory change. Obviously, those are going to take more time. But things like looking at how you communicate, how you individually communicate with your UOCAVA voters is something that you have a lot of leeway, I would think, as either a as an election official at the state or the local level to be able to implement a lot of these recommendations in a fairly short period of time, versus, you know, trying to implement online voter registration if you had to get a statutorily mandated, you know, change and then the policy implementation phase. So I guess that's big. It depends on what you know, which recommendations you're looking at, but there's certainly quite a few of those that you could do at in a relatively short time period.
Kamanzi, this is Michael Vu. I would just, and I'll be short here, just because I know that we're short on time. You probably have several other questions. Let me just say that I think, as David says, as well as Jim, I think, you know, a lot of these recommendations can be instituted. I think if there will there prior to the 2016 election. Of course, some of these is like, for example, like that online voter registration recommendation may be a little bit more difficult if you don't have either statutory or the funds to be able to do something like that. But for example, like in the subgroup or the sub recommendations in terms of the improvement engagement side of it, you know, I think that's just going to be what you can do going into the 2016 elections, and what are you currently doing, and what can you invest your time and your resources in. So I think some are going to be closer to the table than others.
Thank you, Michael. And just kind of piggybacking on what you said, costs do continue to play a big factor in whether certain policies and laws are implemented and administered by state and local policymakers. What are the cost implications for some of the recommendations that you have already discussed today? I know we have a few policymakers on the line. Are these recommendations, are they expensive from your perspective?
Come on, this is Michael Vu again. Let me just say, when it comes down, some are more expensive than others. For example, again, that online voter registration, which I really can't speak of just because it was instituted on a state level, and I don't know what resources were put in terms of the overall cost. But let me just say, again, when it relates to the improvement of the engagement of military, we're using our existing and absorbing those costs when it comes down to engaging our military community through what we are already doing. So if we're already going out and actively participating in a certain area, and we know that there's going to be an overlap of military and overseas and veteran population there, we're certainly trying to speak and communicate to them in that respective manner. You know, I think there's a mutual benefit. For example, as I stated before, is our job fair. There's a mutual benefit there. We know that we're going to need 600 to 800 temporary election workers within our office, and so what better group of individuals to recruit from than our military and overseas and veteran population. Not only benefits them in terms of employment, in some cases it even benefits them that it is a temporary aspect of it, depending on if they're only going to be here for a short stay. For us, it allows us to get their expertise and skill sets for the respective elections, and so you know that we would do things like recruitment either way. It's just that now we're focused on a specific group that could come and help us in terms of some of these efforts. So. I'll let the others speak in terms of their thoughts.
Okay, we have a looks like a question from the audience, and the asker, her name is Margaret Ann Johnson, and she's asking, do you see there ever being a problem with outreach to military being seen as preferential treatment, and how might you respond to such a suggestion? This hasn't come up, but just in case.
This is Tammy, and I can speak to that. I think that I have heard this actually articulated in a variety of ways. Anytime you reach out to any particular voting population or type of voting group, and for me, it seems that the thing that we need to do is ensure that all voters have a level playing field. And for instance, I think that in the case of military and overseas voters, we're trying to overcome the obstacle they have of distance and time. When it comes to voters with disabilities, We offer additional services in many cases, such as special election boards that will go to their house and assist them in voting, other types of voting accommodations to overcome the obstacles they have that are putting them at a disadvantage versus other voters. So I think that you have to be, you're absolutely right, you have to be careful that you aren't seeking out particular voting populations to offer additional assistance or encouraging only certain types of voters to participate, but that you're using your ability to overcome obstacles that are preventing, in some cases, some voters from working on a level playing field or having the same source of access that voters who live locally or who have no physical challenges or language obstacles that can impede their process.
I agree. This is Jim Condos, and I agree with what Tammy just said. Here in Vermont, for instance, when Uwakava voters were provided with a 45-day early vote window, we actually moved our early vote window, which was 30 days for everybody else, out to 45 days. So we try to treat every voter the same, and that's why with our online voter reg and with our My Voter page, anybody can access them no matter where they are.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been a policy conversation with Secretary Jim Condos, David Stafford, Michael Vu, and Tammy Patrick. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.